right, welcome to episode 19 of the Force with Friends podcast. We are picking back up with our story through the Star Wars saga, episodes 1 through 9, making it weave all the way through from start to finish. And this week we are finally getting to the sequel trilogy. So, Kevin, welcome back. We had our
Yeah,
bonus episode live last week. That was a lot of fun. We
was a
had
lot of
some
fun.
engagement there,
Yeah,
but it's time to get back to the meat and potatoes of Star Wars. And we've been talking about this one for a little while, like how we knew the sequels would be tricky. Let's just say that. We
yeah,
knew obviously 1 through 6 are going to mesh together better because that story had been written essentially for decades before we finally saw it all on screen, and we're
yeah,
kind of in some uncharted waters now, but we still think it can happen, making this go from episode 1 to 9 as one continuous story. So that's what we're going to try to do today with The Force Awakens. I know we both watched this weekend and have a
yep.
few topics to hit on. So really quickly, just starting with your overall thoughts of the movie.
I mean, I think it's been rehashed a lot. It's a lot like New Hope, right? I mean,
Yeah.
from the plot to the characters,
Mhm.
it's in a lot of ways it's a rehashing of that story, which at the time I thought was okay, right? It was kind of restarting the whole Star Wars thing. What was it back in? What was that? 2015, 16? When was this? I can't even remember.
2015, December
15.
2015.
Okay. But man, we talked about it after going through the first 6 movies and just how wonderfully they tie together.
Yeah.
This first entry was a little bit like I'm hoping the next two tie in better. This one felt very disconnected. So
Yeah.
I know we had both hoped that it might make it better, but I don't know that that worked for episode 7.
Yeah,
So
that's kind of how I felt. So, episode 7, first of all, it's episode 3 is my favorite Star Wars experience in theater.
hmm,
I was in like 5th grade when it happened. I got to go to the
yeah,
movie twice to watch it. Episode 7, though, is my second favorite. I've seen 6 Star Wars movies in theater now. I didn't see The Phantom Menace in theater, but no, I have. I saw Solo there. Forgot about that one. So I've seen 7
hmm,
Star Wars movies in theater, and episode 7 is by and away my second favorite experience. Star Wars was back. It felt like Star Wars.
yeah,
Like, it felt so much like
yeah,
Star Wars. It was so good, cliffhangers at the end all throughout. I think the rest of the trilogy maybe kind of makes it harder on us for sure. But
yeah.
watching it this way, like going straight through and taking such a deep dive, it did come up a little lacking to me as well. Like disjointed, like you said, very safe play, a lot like A New Hope, but it doesn't necessarily get better from here. So we uh,
Yeah,
we
and I mean, to your
probably
point, it was a fun experience. Like when it came out,
mhm.
like I loved going to the theater and doing the first showings with all the other people. Like it was
Yeah.
a lot of fun. But now at this point, trying to tie it back into these other trilogies, is a little bit of a challenge. So
It is. And I don't think 7 by itself is as big of a challenge to tie
yeah,
together. Like I think we maybe can make that jump, but since we know 8 and 9, I know that's given me a harder time.
yeah,
I don't know about
that's
you,
fair.
but I saw it in theater in Orlando's, which is like the Star Wars mecca right now. So it was such a cool time
I
seeing
bet.
that and just watching it again this time. It's such a pretty movie. Like they did
Yeah,
practical sets. They
yeah,
were on location a lot, which our most recent Star Wars movies were the prequels, which were anything but practical sets and on location and stuff like
yeah,
that. So that was pretty cool to see. And for that, I'll always appreciate the movie and the attention to detail and stuff like that. But the story
yeah,
itself, it starts off with Luke Skywalker has vanished. Now, That was very cool in theaters seeing that. Mark Hamill has talked about reading it and seeing how awesome
Yeah.
it was. Like, oh, this is going to be so cool. And then he reads through the whole script and like he has no lines, which is kind of funny for him.
Yeah.
Like, because he had no clue until that first read through. He sat there for
Right.
like 6 hours just going through all of it.
Like, when do I
But
come in?
yeah, but we see the opening crawl and it starts off with Luke Skywalker has vanished. And honestly, that is very Star Warsy. Now, forget 8 and 9 and the details behind all of it, but just the fact that something has gone wrong and there's this trouble in the galaxy and there's an old Jedi hero somewhere that we need to find that could help us out. That's Star Wars. That's Obi-Wan Kenobi in A New Hope, right? There
Yeah.
was something bad had happened. He and Yoda had exiled and they need him, they need their help. So very similar spot here that we
Yeah.
find ourselves in episode 4.
Yeah, I mean, it's a like, I actually like that opening. I mean, because you close out the original trilogy with this kind of great story and redemptive arc for Vader and with Luke, and he comes out of this on top, and then to go into this new trilogy with this hero, this guy, like you mentioned, that he's gone. Like, we don't know what happened to him. Like, that in and of itself is it's a pretty cool kind of pique your interest type intro. So the idea that Luke Skywalker is missing and vanished, and I mean, I thought it was a good way to start the movie, because it does, I think it immediately kind of gets your intrigue going. It's like, well, where's Luke? What's going on? Why is he gone? So I like the opening crawl in this one. I think it does set a good tone for the movie.
It does, and you jump right in on
Yeah.
Jakku with Lor Santeca and Poe Dameron's
Yeah.
there with him, and you just kind of get these high stakes, like, oh, there's this map to Luke Skywalker, so it almost turns into like a national treasure type thing. Like we're looking for a map, we're gonna get to Luke. So that's kind of where it differs a little bit from a New Hope, because A New Hope, it's just like, hey, we've got to get to Obi-Wan Kenobi, and
Yeah.
Leia obviously knew where Obi-Wan was, and so here it's kind of a mystery where Luke is. Nobody knows. So that's a little bit different there, and it does for a good portion of the movie kind of stick to that, trying to find Luke Skywalker. We'll see later on it ventures away, but just the heaviness behind trying to find him, the urgency, and then obviously the
Yeah.
First Order comes right in, and they're taking people out left and right. They're showing off their
Yeah.
might. So it does have some weight behind the Luke's vanished. There's a First Order.
Right.
We got to find him. Things are pretty serious, and so I thought that was really good to get you going to start the new trilogy.
Yeah, I think the first third of the movie really is pretty good. Like, it really does set a good pace. It moves along really well. I think it does a good job of introducing its new characters, which we'll get into a little bit. But I mean, I love the first 15 minutes of this movie. I think it's fantastic, right? Like, where you have kind of this intrigue with this map, and then Kylo Ren busts onto the scene, and quite honestly, in that first 10 minutes is pretty awesome. Like, the first 15 minutes of the movie it really does do a good job of drawing you in. And then really the first third of it, I feel like, follows through with that. But like you mentioned, some of the other things kind of get lost a little bit later on. But the beginning of the movie's great, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And the Luke Skywalker has vanished. I don't want to jump ahead too far, but like essentially he stays vanished until the last minute and a half of the movie.
Yeah.
Like they get the map to Luke Skywalker. R2 had it the whole time, but
Yep.
R2's been in like a depression for however so long. He's been asleep since Luke was gone, and we kind of forget that too. Like when we watch the rest of the trilogy, we forget that R2's been asleep for like 2 decades or a decade or something. I guess 10 years or so.
Picks a good time to wake up. So
yeah, very convenient. So that's a complaint. We may touch on our complaints at the end, just to air the grievances right before
Get 'em
we
all
go.
out.
But yeah, it's probably healthy to do that. But yeah, like it really paces the movie up until the point that till Han Solo shows up, then he kind of takes over the show.
Yeah, which
Because
I mean, we'll talk about him. I think his character is great throughout the movie. Quite honestly, he's
stole the
definitely one
show.
of the high points for sure.
Yeah, For sure, and it was intended to be that way. So yeah,
Yeah.
the Luke Skywalker has vanished. That has set the stage. So looking back, we probably should have talked about this earlier, but looking back, the last we saw in Star Wars, the Empire's gone.
Hmm.
Luke has redeemed Vader, or Vader's redeemed himself. Luke has drawn him to that. The Emperor is dead. There's supposedly going to be peace. We don't get a lot of details, but that's what's going to happen, right? Peace doesn't
Yeah.
sell movie tickets, though. So there's going to be peace, and then we come here and it's like, man, it's all unraveled. What could have went wrong? Well, what went wrong
Yeah.
was that there is a new empire. So
Yeah.
this new empire is the First Order, and we're going to get more details as this trilogy goes on, kind of how this First Order, who's really pulling the strings, stuff like
Yeah.
that. But we see that there's a new empire, there's a new threat. The opening crawl tells us there is a resistance that's being funded by the New Republic to fight against this militia type group, the First Order.
Yeah.
This movie doesn't really give us any information on the First Order. We know very little about them, which is kind of interesting, kind of frustrating at the same time. But nonetheless, we see that whatever is going on with the New Republic, the governing body, it hasn't worked. The First Order has come to power, and Luke being gone is not helping things out. They really need him to take down this new army that is threatening the New Republic. So we're introduced in the opening crawl to the issue, and then the new enemy, and then the movie starts.
Yeah. And we really catch up with the First Order. Like, I mean, they're at full strength, right? Like
They are.
they're out here building a super weapon, right? Like they got a nice fleet, a bunch of people. I mean, apparently they've been recruiting new stormtroopers and brainwashing them and all that good stuff. So, it is a big jump going from, wow, the Empire's gone to really the Empire's just back.
Right.
Because we've seen little shades of like the reorganization of the Empire, like in Mandalorian, right, where we have all the Moffs and the people sitting around kind of trying to figure out how to restructure, and some are waiting on Thrawn and some have their own projects. So, we kind of get a little bit of that interval, that intermission for them. So it'll be interesting to see where this Thrawn direction leaves us. Because obviously that's going to leave us in some capacity leading into the First Order, I would think. So
it's got to. Yeah.
I'm curious as to how that'll all get set up with that. But yeah, I mean, going into this movie, it's just like, hey, Empire's back, and then that's it. That's all the information you get. We gave it a different name, but it's back.
Yeah, and we'll see later where the name came from in a couple weeks. But it's obviously there's some things that happen off screen that you wish didn't happen off screen. Like we see how the original Empire came to be. So when the original trilogy starts, we have no clue. We just know there's an evil empire. Then 20 years later, we get there, 30 years later, whatever. We figure out, okay, this is how the Empire came to be. So really look at all the Disney Plus series as how the prequel trilogy brings up how the Empire came to be. The Disney Plus series is probably going to bring up how the First Order came to be when it's all said and done. So I'll reserve judgment on that happening off screen, as the Empire happened off screen as well.
That's fair. Yeah.
That's fair. Planning wise, don't know that that's how they planned it to go, but that's how it's going to go. So this First Order is like bigger than the Empire, seemingly better than the Empire. They've got a Palpatine-esque leader in Snoke, like this Force user that's real scary and ominous. You've got a leader in a black suit and a mask like Vader and Kylo Ren. You've got the obnoxious, kind of like Grand Moff Tarkin. You get that in Hux. They've got a Death Star, which is just Ilum, where they get the lightsaber kyber crystals from. That's a planet fueling their new Death Star. They've got a lot going on. We come really to this 1 year period in Star Wars history, because that's all the sequel trilogy is 1 year out of all this, which is probably one of its bigger flaws, but it's only 1 year, and we catch them at the height of their power, which is pretty cool, because I think for the Empire, we may be catching them, on the downward slope as far as like, okay, Vader's starting to awaken to some things inside him. The tide is starting to turn. In The Force Awakens, really, the Empire's at full strength at this point, or the First Order is at full strength.
Yeah, no, that's fair to say. And I'm curious. There are things I wish we had backstory on, right? Like, how is it that the Republic failed so miserably? I mean, we're seeing kind of the difficulty and the issues with it in some of the shows going on, where they've gotten pretty comfortable where they're at this point. But to the extent where like you're literally a resistance again, right? Like you're not even like the official official army of the Republic's fighting. It's not even them fighting back, right? Like what is it that went so wrong that it's not even them challenging the First Order? It's this resistance that they're funding. Like those are things I want to know. I'm really curious because I feel like there could be a really good story in that. So I'm hoping at some point we get what really went wrong with this New Republic.
That's probably the most realistic thing in all of Star Wars is like this one group paying off this other group to fight their battles. Like, not to get too political, but that's kind of how the real world works, right? Like nowadays, one country pays off somebody else to take care of business for them. So that's maybe the most realistic thing about all these movies. But
because I mean, in the movie, you got the First Order who's out there causing all kind of havoc, and they're like, the fleet's just hanging out with the Republic worlds, just. We're going to wipe out the fleet, all the worlds at the same time. I mean, it's just, they're just kind of hanging out. So it's an interesting dynamic for sure.
I know we're talking about the new Empire here. Like they've got all new stuff. Like their stuff is very good. They got the funding. They got a lot of stuff, but the Resistance has some new stuff, but at the same time, it's like the Tantive 4 is still a thing, and then there's the Millennium Falcon ends up being in it again. The X-Wings probably aren't the newest of new. So a lot of similarities between the original trilogy, but it's like, I kind of want to know why. Like, if there is this governing body, why can they not defend themselves? But either way, we've got Luke vanished. We've got the big new enemies in the First Order. And then we also are introduced to some new heroes. This is actually... It's a lot like A New Hope as well. But at the same time, these are the characters that this generation of Star Wars fans, like if they're kids growing up with it, this is their Luke, Han, and Leia here, which is kind of a cool thing for Star Wars. For me, it was Padme, Anakin, and Obi-Wan. And, for in the 70s and 80s, it was Luke, Han, and Leia. And then this group has Rey, Finn, and Poe. So we're introduced to some interesting characters. Rey, really along the same lines of Luke, right? Desert planet. Force sensitive, orphan, looking for the place in the galaxy, good at flying ships. Rey's great at everything, but it's kind of another story being told along the same vein. And then you've got Poe is a lot like Leia as far as being a part of this resistance, but then he's also a lot like Han in that he can pilot a ship really well, and he's kind of a flyboy, if you will. But Finn is probably the most interesting to me, given that he's like a bad guy turned good. We didn't really see that in A New Hope. So that's something that's a little bit different. What do you think about these new characters?
I like the introduction of the new characters. I think it's done pretty well. I mean, like you said, I think the Rey thing is intentional, right? It's very much Anakin's start. It's very much Luke's start, right? Like stranded on this desert planet with dreams of doing something greater, right? Like that's all three of them. So I think that was very intentional. I do like Finn's character. I think he was really set up with a lot of possibility to take this guy who is a stormtrooper, who's, stormtroopers are, you glance at him and you don't think anything about him. So to pull a character from that, I think was fun and interesting. And he really kind of fills that Han Solo slot a little bit, where this guy who comes in is not really bought in and just kind of tags along with your crew for a little bit and ultimately buys in. But then Poe, he's a fun character, right? Like he's the wisecracking guy who flies the X-Wing, and like you said, it's not quite like Leia, but he's that veteran with the Resistance, right? Who knows what's going on, who's kind of been along for the ride. So you really do get a trio that's very, very reminiscent of your original trio, which I honestly don't mind, right? Like I had no issues with introductions of the characters. I thought they had a lot of potential in them. So in terms of just bringing in these new characters, I thought it was fine. And to your like you said, I think it's cool for kids to have their own characters, right? Like,
Yeah.
regardless of how much we liked or didn't like the sequels, like the fact that there are kids that really bought in and love these characters, I always think that's fun. So
Yeah,
I don't know.
Seven did an incredible job. Like now that you say it, of introducing everyone. I mean, we've
Yeah,
already talked about
that's hard.
starting on Jakku with Poe and Lor Santeca there, and you get
Yeah,
like there's some weight going on to what he's doing, and you get this idea that Poe's kind of is a big deal in the Resistance, and then you get the jokes where Finn is certainly not a big deal in the Resistance, but he starts saying, he's a
yeah,
big deal, and Han kind of makes fun of him, but
yeah.
you see Finn there. They're all technically on Jakku at the same time. So Finn's on Jakku,
That's true.
and he's not willing to do it. You can tell he can kind of hear something going on, and it's his first battle, and so you've got this conflict in him, which already makes him a complex character 5 minutes into the movie. And then the
Yeah.
way they introduced Rey, it probably should have been a dead giveaway that she's the main character just by how much time they devoted to her introduction. But
Oh, for
they did
sure.
so well with hers. You get that pan going of Jakku, and you see the Star Destroyer down. You see that she's been living in the AT-AT and the Walker. You
Hmm.
see that she's counting off days for something, but you don't know what it is. She's essentially living off of like a bread muffin every day, barely. She can talk to droids. She can fend for herself. Like, she's an interesting character to start off. I don't know if it's a popular opinion, but I think she probably has the best score in all of Star Wars.
Hmm.
I think her theme is right up there with the
Yeah, I
binary
do like her score.
sunsets for me. I think the Force theme is probably one, but then
Yeah.
Ray's theme is probably my second favorite. It's so good. It's almost Harry
Hmm.
Potterish. So when we're
It is
introduced
very
to these
whimsical.
characters, yeah, it is. It's got all that in it. I don't know music that well, but as well as I should at least. But they do a good job with that,
Hmm.
introducing all three for sure. And they are all set up on really a collision course for what we're going to see at the end of the film. Ray ends up being kidnapped. Finn ends up buying in, and then Poe obviously is the leader. So,
Yeah.
in typical Star Wars fashion, we kind of have all three going their own way for a minute, but then they all end up somewhat together at the end of the film, taking out the bad guys. And that is also very much so Star Wars. Like every single Star
Yeah.
Wars movie kind of follows that pattern.
Yeah. I mean, with regardless of the issues we might have had with plot and whatnot, it feels very much Star Wars, right? Which
Yeah.
is, if you're going to go sit in a theater, you at least want it to feel like you're watching Star Wars. So that is one compliment I can give it. Is
Yeah.
you mentioned it earlier, just between the visuals to the characters, it still felt like Star Wars throughout. I think some of that's helped by some of these legacy characters still coming back in.
Yeah.
These legends of the Star Wars universe. But no, it definitely feels like Star Wars. I would agree with that
Yeah.
100%.
I agree. And really like the formula for a Star Wars movie is good too, right? It's worked throughout the
Yeah,
decades. So they played their hand safe with these, and they did every Star Wars movie except for episode 3 does follow that formula of main characters split apart and then come back together to beat the bad guys at the end. 3 kind of does it, but it's just the good guys are fighting each other. So
yeah,
but
yeah.
same idea,
Different
and it
ending,
works.
right?
Yeah, different
Yeah,
ending, but it works out. So they did it here too. Again, some people are going to complain, oh, it's not new enough. But as we see as the trilogy goes on, people complain that things are way too different. So what do you do, right? Like
yeah.
I
So
don't know.
it's a hard balance to strike, right?
Yeah,
Like we'll be honest and open about our opinions, but at the same time, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that I've gone out and written a blockbuster movie either. So
yeah.
our
I'll say
opinions are our
playing
opinions,
it
but
safe worked.
yeah,
Playing it
no,
safe worked.
it, you know, The Force Awakens is not a bad start to a movie trilogy.
No,
Um,
it's really good.
I mean, there's some, like, and we'll talk about it a little bit in this episode, but I mean, despite those issues, it still feels like a good Star Wars. It's entertaining to watch. Like, to
Yeah,
me, some of the character interactions are a little goofier than they need to be, but
yeah.
not to the point where I'm like, oh, I can't watch this. This is terrible. No, it's still fun to watch, and I enjoyed The Force Awakens. So, as a movie, it's not a terrible start. I will say that.
Right. Yeah. No, I agree. So we go to these new heroes and they end up encountering our old heroes, which is exciting,
Yeah.
right? So
Yep.
the promotionals for the movie is we're gonna kind of get this story of Luke, Han, and Leia continued, and we know that Mark and Carrie and Harrison Ford are all signed on. So from like
Yeah.
2012 to 2015, we're like, this is gonna be their story. There's gonna be new characters as well, but it's gonna be about them again. Turns out that wasn't really the case, but they all kind
Yeah.
of get their spot in the sun, which they
Yep.
deserve it. And we start off Ray and Finn are on the Millennium Falcon. They've escaped Jakku and they end up getting captured again, but they get captured by Han Solo and Chewie,
Yep.
who has lost the Falcon. And so at this point we learn that things have went terribly wrong. So Han's
Yeah.
kind of out on his own. He's with Chewie. He's going back to the only thing that he's ever been good at, which is what he says, which is being a smuggler. So
Yeah.
that's what he's done. Leia goes back to the only thing that she's ever been good at, which is leading a rebellion. So she's the leader of the resistance. And it's all kind of shaped around the idea that they had sent their son off to Luke's Jedi school, but then one of the kids went rogue. Luke went and vanished, and Leia and Han have not been the same since sending their kid off.
Right.
We don't really, for a brief period of time, we still technically don't know it's Kylo Ren yet. The movie
Right.
does pretty good at holding that off. I think Snoke says it, right? Is the first person to
Yeah.
say, like, your
Yep.
father Han Solo,
father,
and that's kind
yeah.
of the reveal there, and then they take it and run with it. But we see that things have went south. It's a lot like how Legends kind of plays a similar deal. They've played from that where Han and
Yeah.
Leia's twins, one falls to the dark side. So here we get that Skywalker story of a Skywalker having the dark side in them essentially and succumbing to it, and that splits Han and Leia, which we just saw them together for like 3 minutes in Return of the Jedi, and now
Yeah.
they're not.
Yeah. Han is one of my favorite parts of this movie because if you look at how he was built up in the Legend stuff, made into this character who really became like a really good character who still felt like he was always in over his head a little bit.
Yeah.
I felt like they did a really good job of pulling Han back in as that character to where,
Yeah.
there was a period in Legends where the same thing happened with Han and Leia. They actually lost a kid and they kind of split. They went their separate ways. So I like this story that to deal with it, they just had to go back to what they knew, right? Like I thought that was really good. But yeah, Han's the highlight of this for me. I know Harrison Ford has conflicting emotions about Han Solo, but despite that, he's very, very good at playing him.
Yeah.
I love that we enter with he's lost the Falcon and he owes two different like crime syndicates money that he's borrowed from. Like
Yeah, that's
that
funny.
that to me is so Han, and it's so legacy Han too. Like the character
Yeah.
they built up. So I love that they pulled in that character and built him up that way because that it felt like Han Solo, it read like Han Solo. And so the way he kind of leads this cast throughout this movie to me is really probably the high point of The Force Awakens.
Yeah, he picks up the movie and runs with it. When
Yeah,
the Chewie
for sure.
we're home, from that point forward until about 15 minutes left in the movie, it's Han Solo's movie. And so, like
What
you
happens
said,
with 15 minutes left?
well, he's dead. Yeah. So yeah, then we just kind of forget that he's ever there until episode 9. But no. So yeah, we get these two characters and we see a lot of development in Han just throughout this movie. So
Yeah.
in the original trilogy, he's always like the commitment issues. Like he's in it, but he's not. He's in it, but he's not. It's the same in 4. It's the same in 5. In 6, he surprises them and he's like, "Count me in," to go on the mission.
Yeah.
Well, in 7, he's ran away from the fight. Like there is a new empire going on. Clearly, I would think he and Chewie are fully aware of it. And this time,
Yeah.
got nothing to do with it, right? He's just out Ponzi scheming all these different smuggler gangs and paying one with the other's money and things like that. It's catching up to him. He's got his ship back. So he's back to the old. But as this story goes on, we see he's reunited with Leia, obviously, when he encounters Rey. And so that they go to Maz Kanata's cantina. I forget the planet that's on. I don't know if you remember that, but Either way, they're at her
I
castle
can't think of it right now.
and ends up reunited with Leia, and she pulls him back into the fight. Just like
Yeah.
all the original trilogy goes, it's always Leia pulling him back into the fight. And so we see that here, and we learn obviously that Kylo Ren is his son, and so
Yep.
that's the driving force for him at this point. They're going to destroy Starkiller Base, and this is really when the story shifts from Luke has vanished to this side quest of, oh, by the way, there's another Death Star. And so they
Yeah.
all are like, hey, let's go blow this thing up first, and then we'll get back to Luke, which we'll
Right.
get to that in a minute. But that's what happens. Han goes, Leia essentially sends him. We don't get a lot of Leia in this movie, just, that she's sad about the Ben thing, obviously. Han's sad about it. They go their separate ways, and she sends him back. That's essentially all of Leia's story in this movie. We'll pick up a lot with her in 8 for sure.
Mm.
But Han goes, and we ultimately see his commitment to this cause is not really to the cause, but it's to his son. He's going to
Yeah.
go out and try to bring him back no matter what, which is like the crowning achievement of Han Solo. It's the guy who always ran, and he ran from the problems, and he would
Yeah.
come back and do something heroic, but he was never 100% in. Well, here he was. And so he goes and confronts his failures, his issues head on. Obviously, he doesn't make it out of it, but, we see that development. That's what Harrison Ford wanted out of this character. And we do get that nice bow thrown on Han Solo here. And I thought it was a great way to end the movie.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think, Carrie Fisher's really a side. She's a supporting character within The Force Awakens, but her presence on screen is so good with the way she interacts with Han, eventually Rey. Like, even in the few minutes that she gets, she's great. And that interaction she has with Han, where they kind of reconvene and get back together, it does provide a really cool character moment for Han, because he's committed to not messing up again, right? Like, he's been this guy who's run, and he's probably let her down a lot in the midst of these issues going on, right? He's not present. She's trying to handle this thing on her own. She admits she kind of ran from it too, but like, there is a sense that he's there and he's committed. He's like, I'm going to do this the right way. I'm going to get my son. I'm going to bring him back to Leia, and I'm going to do this right. And so he does have a really good conclusion to his character arc, because it is the opposite of who he's been. And so to see him have that moment where he prioritizes, something other than his comfort and his self, and not having to be challenged with these things, with his emotions, he goes full in on it. He's committed to doing it. And while he doesn't succeed here, like, this is obviously we're not going to get into it, but this will be a huge moment in the future of this trilogy.
Yeah.
Is this confrontation that he has with his son will come back pretty significantly. So,
yep.
I hated losing him because I love the character, but I thought he had a great arc in the movie. So,
in the same way that Vader striking down Ben Kenobi turns out to be the spark, it gets Luke in the battle. It eventually leads to Vader's downfall, right? So everything from that point forward, Obi-Wan had to die to make everything work, right? So Han Solo, he has to die, and that starts the cracking of Ben Solo, of Kylo Ren, if you will, because he never gets over it. You learn throughout the next couple movies, he will never shake it. So this is the one moment that gets the ball rolling for the Resistance, really, is Han Solo sacrifice himself, because Kylo Ren turning, he's kind of the strong arm of this new empire, if you will.
Yeah.
So it's a big moment in this trilogy. Obviously, it's a big moment in Star Wars, because Han is one of the original characters. But that takes us to Kylo Ren here. So, in my opinion, Adam Driver might be the best cast actor for a character in all of Star Wars. I think by far he's the best actor that Star Wars has had. He's probably one of the best actors alive today, and it's not often that we get to say that and Star Wars in the same sentence. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And his character is so Star Warsy as well. I mean, it's the classic story. You've got this force sensitive, young, talented Jedi who is everyone on one side of things thinks, oh, he's the next great thing. Everyone on
Yeah.
the other side's like, hey, we've got to get him on our side. We can turn the tides of things, talking about the dark side of things. And so that in the original trilogy, you see all the focus on Luke from the Jedi, you see it from the Emperor. In the prequel trilogy, it's the same with Anakin. You see the focus from Palpatine trying to get Anakin. You see the Jedi, oh, he's the chosen one, we got to have him. And in the sequel trilogy, Luke kind of goes all in on that Skywalker blood and Ben Solo, but so does Snoke, so does the First Order, ultimately, so
Yeah.
does the Emperor. So it's very much Star Wars as well. And I don't know anybody that has any complaints with the character of Kylo Ren. I think it played out very well, even if
Yeah.
lately we know that the plans kind of changed as it went on. I still think they did a great job with him.
Yeah, he's an interesting mashup of like Anakin, Luke, and Vader, right? Like he's kind of like
Yeah.
has elements of them all combined. I mean, he's got kind of that hot-hated, brusque nature of Anakin, but he's also still pretty naive and not very disciplined in a way Luke
Yeah.
was. But then he's also got this Vader thing that he's trying, like he's actively trying to be this
Yeah.
next Vader, right? Like that's a
Yeah.
huge part of what he's trying to do is force like this persona that I'm going to be who my grandfather was,
Yeah.
which sets him up to be a really interesting character. Like, why is
Right.
this who he's revering? Like, how did he get to this point?
Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting questions that come up with that, and I love how you come in on Vader really throughout the trilogy up until Return of the Jedi, where we see him break a little bit, and you see some of that vulnerability and whatnot. Vader is calm, composed, he's in control, he is committed to this mission of the dark side, where it seems like Kylo Ren is like really forcing it, right? Like it seems like he has to work himself up into these frenzies when he fights. He's erratic, he's kind of crazed, and I almost feel like it's because it's not natural to him, right? Like this dark side thing that he's still kind of fighting against, it doesn't seem natural. It seems like he's forcing it at every avenue, and I just think that makes him a really interesting character, because I feel like you read across him that this is not really where he wants to be, but he's been convinced this is where he wants to be. And so
Yeah.
the character of Kylo Ren and his introduction in this movie, I think is fantastic. They really set him up to be a pretty compelling and interesting character with some of those things.
Yep. And he also has a super cool lightsaber. He's got the cross guard. That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yep.
He's big and
It
menacing
looks
like
cool.
Vader.
He is.
He chooses to be in the mask, which is a complex thing, right? Like it's almost as if he doesn't understand Vader. He's just been kind of fed a false bill of goods, which we know he has been. I just finished the Rise of Skywalker book, and it's actually pretty good. And so we learn, and this ties in here, but we learn that he's been being manipulated and lied to the whole way. They tell him he can't go back. He's done so much bad. Han and Leia would not want him back. Luke wouldn't want him back. He can't do enough good to overcome the bad. That's what Snoke told him the whole time. And like you said, he wants to go back. When he's on the bridge with Han Solo and he's talking about how conflicted he is, that's not him manipulating Han Solo. He's genuinely convicted. He doesn't want this, but it's what he has. It's all that he has. He tells Han it's too late. There's nothing he can do. And so it's the opposite of Vader. It's a lot of Anakin in him. Like he wants these best intentions, but it's the opposite of Anakin too, right? Because Anakin just kind of falls into this, but he falls into good and he's clawing his way out as he goes through.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to see that, but at the same time, he does, as the trilogy goes on, he kind of makes it his own. And I think that's a big testament to Adam Driver and just taking this character and doing what he wants with it. But he kills Han Solo, then he is in the fight with Rey. He's still got that mindset that all the good bad guys have. Like, you need a teacher, you need to join me, because he sees she's strong. And so he's kind of picking up on the dark side thing as well, because Vader's like, oh, Luke, you need to join, and the Emperor wants Anakin to join. It's just the same thing over and over again. Well, Rey's strong, he needs Rey to join. But it turns out when their minds are linked in the Force Awakens, he has this connection with Rey. And so I think
Hmm.
it's maybe a little bit deeper than just wanting to be evil with Rey, but he actually kind of has this connection with her, and that's going to be the building blocks of the story moving forward. Is he and Rey? It's pretty interesting how they finish this movie off.
Yeah, I think one of the praises I can give the movie is the consistency of like how the dark side is used to manipulate and draw people in, and the
Yeah,
fact that there is like this natural pull back to the light, right? Like the dark side is not. I mean, you look at like the idea of balance of like light and dark, like within all people, there's that balance. Like Yoda didn't say anger is the dark side. He didn't say fear is the dark side. It was all these things lead to the dark side, right? These
yeah,
normal emotions that are dark versus these feelings of compassion and kindness that are of the light, right? Like in a person, there's always going to be maybe a natural compulsion to be pulled back to those things, especially like family. And so we see that throughout the first six movies, right? The allure of family and the redemptive concept of family to people who have been drawn into this thing and manipulated into it. And so I do like that we continue to see that. It still works the same way. And one of the things I mentioned this to you earlier, it made me think about it in Legends. There was this teaching about Sith sacrifice, right? And so one of the things that a trainee had to do in order to progress in their training before they could finish it was they had to sacrifice a person or someone close to them that they
mm-hmm.
love, because the idea with the Sith was it's power at all costs, right? Like there's nothing that's more important than attaining power. And so if there's anything that pulls you away from that or draws you away from that, the test was you had to get rid of it. And so I feel like that really falls in line with what Kylo Ren's doing here when he has that great conversation with Han Solo. Honestly, that's one of the biggest emotional scenes in all of Star Wars is
Yeah,
when Adam Driver is delivering those lines, because it's genuine. He doesn't
yeah,
want to do this, right? But at the same time, he's convinced that if he can get rid of this feeling of wanting to come back and the struggle of feeling like he's doing the wrong thing, if he can eliminate that in the form of Han Solo, he'll be fine. Like all the problems go away because that's what he's been fed. And so yeah, I love the way they tied up some of that stuff. I think some of that stuff, the consistency with the other movies, and then the wanting to pull in Rey, right? Like
yeah,
now I'll be the master. That's a very,
yeah,
very Sith thing. And
yeah.
so there are definitely high points in this movie that do make sense and flow with the previous films. He's definitely one of them, I think.
Oh yeah, he's the highlight of probably the highlight of Disney Star Wars for me up
Yeah,
until Ahsoka happened. But yeah,
yeah.
he's so good. So kind of tying this all together, The Force Awakens into the story of Star Wars. So episodes 1 through 3, Anakin's found, falls to the dark side, has kids. Episodes 4 through 6, we see Anakin's redeemed through his son Luke. The Empire falls.
Hmm.
The Emperor supposedly dies. We'll see that. But here it takes a turn away from the Skywalker story to an extent. So we're carrying on this story through Kylo Ren, and in this movie, very briefly, through Luke Skywalker. We get this hope that, hey, Luke Skywalker is back in the fight, and so that's kind of where
Yeah,
we're left. So Luke Skywalker ends the war in 6, and then in 7, like, oh no, there's another war, but we found Luke again, so there's a chance. There's a Skywalker on the bad side, now there's a Skywalker on the good side, and it's almost as if there's this great hope, like, okay, the Skywalkers are back, or Luke is back, and so now we can go win this war. And so that's really where this movie leaves us. I think we
yeah,
had a very difficult time just through this conversation, kind of making it all wrap together, because honestly, it doesn't. There's a lot of complaints to be had with this movie. It just doesn't fit, in my opinion. The sequel trilogy,
yeah.
after watching it this way, it doesn't fit with the originals. That doesn't mean they're all terrible movies. It doesn't mean I hate
Right.
them. It doesn't mean anything like that. It's just I don't think 7 fits very well with 1 through 6. I think 8 fits even less, and I think 9 is I don't know. So it's interesting. It's unfortunate, but we're
Yeah.
gonna try. So to this point, Luke is back. and the Resistance has a hope against this Empire, and that's kind of how this fits into the Star Wars story. I don't know if you can spin it any better.
uh, man, I mean, I agree with you. It feels. I don't know if it'll get better, but it right now it feels very disconnected from the other 6 movies.
Yeah.
Like not that everything about it was bad, but just going through how well connected everything else was. And really, I think a lot of us were expecting a story that was really made and enriched by the movies that came before it. It just feels so much like a completely different thing. Still Star Wars, but not a continuation of this saga. I mean, you open up with the Luke has vanished thing, and they were right. Like, Luke has vanished from this movie, right? Like, I mean, they kind of pull you. I feel like in the first movie, they pull you in with these characters. Yeah. And aside from Han Solo, like the other 2 are kind of ignored. Like Luke pops up at the end. And so it just feels disjointed in how they use the characters. I'm still always going to be mad that they're not on screen together at any point during.
We're gonna get that in the Dave Filoni movie.
Yeah, So, I can acknowledge where it did some things right, but it doesn't feel like it fits at this point. So,
yeah,
and I hate saying that, but
yeah, I know. Like, and I don't hate The Force Awakens at all. I like the movie a lot. I think, like we said, it does a good job at resurrecting Star Wars after 20 years or 10 years. It had been 10 years, I guess. So bringing Star Wars back. And so it's just, you kind of got to call it the way you see it. When you look at the whole big picture, it doesn't fit very well. I don't think, maybe they should not have built it as a continuation of the original story. Maybe it should have just been like, hey, this is a new story in the Star Wars universe. The characters are still here, but this is going to be Rey's story. And there was no plan, obviously. Like, if Disney could redo it, I think they would. For sure they would redo it, because it made a lot of money. Maybe they wouldn't, but it just doesn't fit. And so I'll kind of leave it there. The sequel trilogy doesn't seem to fit in, but that doesn't mean it's all negative. There's some bad parts. There's some great parts. We'll hit both of them. But the story as it is right now, Luke's vanished. Luke's back. We'll kind of see where episode 8 goes.
Well, you make a good point. I think if they had billed it as something else, I think it might have been better received, right? But
because it is something
I do think it was billed as like, hey, here's the end, right? The end of this saga, the end of this story. And obviously there was no plan in place from the beginning. So that's a good point. If they had just been upfront about, hey, this is something different, I do think it would not have gotten as much of the backlash it got. So it's interesting to think about it that way.
Well, and one last thing here. This will be the last thing. But they completely didn't understand that Star Wars is Anakin's story. It's all Anakin's story. And so when you miss that, if you miss the main point of Star Wars, you're not going to get it right. And so the original trilogy works because Luke's whole ambition is to redeem his father, is what it turns into. And so Luke Skywalker can't even save the trilogy. Like, even if you were to say, oh, it's all about Luke, well, Star Wars isn't all about Luke. That's the whole thing. 3 movies are all about Luke, but the other 3 aren't in the prequels. So it's a hard balance to find. I think when they missed that point, they missed it all. And we'll see as the story goes on. That's what happens.
Gosh, because if you could go back to when people were speculating before that final movie, how much of it was about how Anakin Skywalker is going to pop up, right?
Rise of Skywalker. They thought it was going to be Anakin.
And I don't know how that got missed, right? I mean, that was so. Yeah, that's definitely a fair criticism.
Yeah. So again, that seems real negative. We don't think it fits. We're telling the story of Star Wars as a whole. It's hard to do it with the sequels. That's just kind of how it is. But next week, we're going to, I guess this weekend, we'll try to find some time
keep plugging along.
The Last Jedi and break it down. That should be a lot of fun. See how that fits. But if
I like The Last Jedi independently.
As a movie.
Yes. As a movie itself, it's got some parts I don't like, but if it were not part of this other thing and it didn't,
have Star Wars on it. Yeah. But yeah, so that's where we're going to be next week. If it seems choppy and like we're having a hard time putting it all together, we are. That's why it looks that way. But otherwise, thanks for watching. This was episode 19. So next week will be episode 20. And then once we wrap up this, we may do another live episode. We'll see. But otherwise, we will catch y'all next week.